deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers don't reach, and the nearest neighbor lives 40 miles away. 16-year-old Marcus Chen had been living alone for 3 years. The locals called him the Ghost Boy, the kid who vanished into the wilderness after his family died in that terrible accident. But Marcus wasn't just surviving up here. He was hiding. The blizzard had been raging for 2 days when the 8-foot grizzly smashed through his reinforced cabin door like it was made of paper. Most people would have frozen in terror or reached for a rifle, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching, something that revealed the extraordinary secret he'd been carrying since childhood. You see, Marcus wasn't just any mountain boy. He was the son of Dr. Sarah Chen, the world's leading animal behaviorist who had taught him to communicate with wildlife, using techniques the scientific community thought were pure fantasy. As the massive bear stood in his doorway, bleeding and desperate, Marcus realized this wasn't an attack, it was a plea for help. But why would a wild grizzly seek out a human for help, and what was hunting it through the storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus slowly set down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir his evening stew. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows across the small cabin's walls. The bear's massive frame filled the doorway, snow swirling around its dark silhouette. Blood dripped from 3 parallel gashes across its left shoulder, and its breathing came in labored puffs of vapor. "Easy," Marcus whispered, not in English but in the subtle combination of tone, posture, and micro-movements his mother had taught him. He lowered his shoulders, tilted his head slightly, and extended his right hand palm down, a gesture that sighed, "See you. I'm not a threat." The bear's small eyes fixed on him. Most people thought bears were dumb, but Marcus knew better. This one was intelligent, calculating. It had made a choice to come here, to his cabin specifically. In 3 years of mountain living, no large predator had ever approached his home. He'd made sure of that through careful scent management and behavioral conditioning of the local wildlife. This bear was different. It wasn't from around here. Marcus took a half step forward, his movements deliberate and calm. The bear's muscles tensed, but it didn't retreat or charge. Instead, it made a sound Marcus had only heard once before, a deep, throaty vocalization his mother had called a distress confluence. It meant the animal was caught between fear and desperation. "You're not running from the storm," Marcus said softly, reading the bear's body language like text on a page. "You're running from something else." The wind howled outside, driving snow through the broken doorframe. But beneath that sound, Marcus caught something else, a low, mechanical humming that didn't belong in these mountains. His blood went cold. They had found him. Marcus had always known this day would come. 3 years of carefully constructed isolation, of becoming invisible to the world below, and somehow they'd tracked him down. But why now? Why in the middle of the worst blizzard in decades? The bear shifted its weight, and Marcus noticed something else. Around its thick neck, barely visible through the matted fur, was a thin silver collar. His heart raced. This wasn't just any bear, it was tagged, monitored, possibly even controlled. "They used you to find me, didn't they?" Marcus breathed, understanding flooding through him. The bear's distress made sense now. Whatever technology they'd put on it was causing pain, forcing it to track Marcus's unique scent signature, something his mother had encoded into him before she died. The mechanical humming grew louder. Through the storm, Marcus could make out the distant glow of searchlights sweeping across the mountainside. Vehicles probably modified for extreme terrain. They'd be here within minutes. The bear made that sound again, more urgent this time. It was trying to warn him. Marcus moved quickly to his emergency pack, muscle memory taking over. 3 years of preparation for this moment. He grabbed the go-bag from its hiding spot beneath the floorboards, along with his mother's research journal, the real reason they were hunting him. The journal contained secrets that powerful people would kill to possess or destroy. "I know you don't want to be their weapon," Marcus said to the bear as he shouldered his pack. The animal's ears flicked forward. It understood. The collar. If I can remove it, you'll be free. The bear stepped aside as Marcus approached. This close, he could see the cruel device embedded in its fur, tiny LED lights blinking in a pattern that made his stomach turn. His mother's research had warned about this technology. Outside, the humming grew into a roar. They were almost here. Marcus pulled out his knife and looked into the bear's eyes. "Trust me," he whispered, knowing that both their lives depended on the next 60 seconds. The grizzly's massive form filled the doorway, snow and splinters of wood clinging to its dark fur. Steam rose from its body in the frigid air, and Marcus could smell the wild musk mixed with something else. Blood, fresh blood. His hand moved instinctively toward the hunting knife on his belt, then stopped. The bear wasn't charging. It stood there, swaying slightly, its enormous head hanging low. One massive paw was raised off the ground, and Marcus could see dark stains in the snow beneath it. "Easy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Easy there." The grizzly's eyes found his, intelligent eyes, not the mindless fury he'd expected. There was something else in that gaze. Pain, exhaustion, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of trust that made Marcus's chest tighten. The bear took a stumbling step forward, and Marcus saw the full extent of its injuries. Deep gashes across its left shoulder, claw marks that were too deliberate, too precise to be from another bear. The raised paw was mangled, caught in something metallic that glinted in the firelight. A trap. Someone had set illegal traps in his territory. The grizzly's legs buckled, and it collapsed just inside the threshold, its breathing labored and shallow. The cabin floor shook under its weight. Marcus stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind racing through possibilities. He should grab the rifle, put the animal out of its misery. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, he found himself moving slowly toward the injured beast. "What did they do to you?" he murmured, crouching just outside the bear's reach. The trap was a cruel piece of work, serrated jaws that had bitten deep into bone and muscle. Blood had frozen in dark crystals around the wound. The grizzly's eyes tracked his movement, but it made no aggressive moves. It simply lay there, chest rising and falling in ragged rhythms. Marcus had seen that look before, in different circumstances, in a different life. The look of a warrior who'd fought too long, lost too much, and had nothing left but the hope that someone, anyone, might understand. He thought of Kabul, of the medic tent where he'd patched up soldiers and civilians alike while mortars fell like deadly rain. Different wounds, same desperate need. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly, not sure if he was trying to convince the bear or himself. "But you've got to trust me." Moving with deliberate slowness, Marcus stood and walked to his supply cabinet. The bear's eyes followed him, but its head didn't move. He pulled out his medical kit, the comprehensive one he'd sworn he'd never use again, and spread its contents on his table: antiseptic, surgical tools, heavy-duty sutures, morphine. The wind screamed through the broken doorway, sending snow swirling around them both. Marcus grabbed a thick canvas tarp and some rope, working quickly to seal the breach. The bear watched his every movement with those intelligent eyes. "First things first," Marcus said, loading a syringe with a carefully calculated dose of sedative. Not enough to knock the grizzly out completely, that could be fatal given its injuries, but enough to dull the pain and keep it calm. He approached slowly, talking in low, steady tones. "This is going to help. Just a little stick, then we can take care of that paw." The needle slid into the thick muscle of the bear's shoulder. The grizzly flinched but didn't strike out. Within minutes, its breathing became more regular, the tension leaving its massive frame. Marcus knelt beside the trapped paw, studying the mechanism. Military-grade equipment, he realized with a surge of anger. Whoever had set this wasn't some backwoods poacher. The trap was designed for maximum damage, minimum escape chance. Working with the precision that came from years of battlefield medicine, he began the delicate process of opening the trap's jaws. Each click of the mechanism seemed to echo in the cabin. The bear's breathing remained steady, but Marcus could feel its awareness, the way it was evaluating him, judging his intentions. The trap finally released with a wet, metallic sound. The bear's paw was mangled but salvageable. Marcus cleaned the wounds with methodical efficiency, his hands steady despite the surreal nature of his patient. As he worked, muscle memory took over, the same focused calm that had helped him save lives in impossible conditions. The grizzly never moved, never threatened. It simply lay there, occasionally letting out a low rumble that almost sounded like gratitude. As Marcus sutured the deepest lacerations, his mind wandered to the implications. Illegal traps meant poachers, probably the kind with military connections given the equipment. And if they were bold enough to set traps this close to his cabin, they'd likely be back to check them. He finished bandaging the paw and sat back on his heels, studying his unlikely patient. The bear's eyes were clearer now, more alert despite the sedation. There was something almost human in its gaze, recognition, perhaps even respect. "What am I doing?" Marcus whispered to himself, but he already knew the answer. He was remembering who he used to be. The bear's breathing had settled into a rhythm that almost matched his own. Jake sat motionless in the corner, his back against the cold log wall, watching the massive creature that had claimed his home. 3 hours had passed since the grizzly had collapsed near his fireplace, and the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. He'd used the time to study his uninvited guest. The bear was enormous, easily 800 pounds, maybe more, male, judging by the broad skull and muscular shoulders. But it was the wounds that held Jake's attention, deep gashes across the animal's flank, partially healed but infected. Older scars crisscrossed its hide like a roadmap of violence. This wasn't just any bear seeking shelter. This was a fighter, a survivor. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jake's military training whispered tactical assessments in his mind, despite his efforts to silence it. Exit routes, blocked by the storm and the bear's position near the door. Weapons, his rifle leaned against the wall 8 feet away, might as well be 8 miles. The bear could cover that distance faster than Jake could blink. Advantages: the animal was wounded, exhausted, and seemingly non-aggressive for the moment. But advantages could shift in an instant. He'd learned that lesson in Afghanistan, watching situations transform from routine to deadly in heartbeats. The bear's ears twitched at something only it could hear. Jake froze, following its gaze to the door. Through the howling wind came another sound, a low, guttural call that made the hair on his neck stand up. The grizzly in his cabin rumbled deep in its chest, a sound Jake felt in his bones. There was another bear out there. The wounded grizzly struggled to its feet, favoring its injured side. Jake pressed himself further into the corner as the animal moved toward the door, its massive frame blocking most of the firelight. It paused at the threshold, sniffing the air that rushed through the gaps in the damaged doorframe. Another call echoed through the storm, closer this time. The bear in Jake's cabin answered with a sound that was part growl, part roar. Whatever was happening outside, his unexpected roommate was sending a clear message: this territory was occupied. Jake's mind raced. 2 bears, a storm, a cabin with a compromised door. Every survival instinct screamed at him to reach for his rifle, but something else held him back. The wounded bear hadn't shown aggression toward him, only toward whatever was outside. It had claimed sanctuary here, just as Jake had claimed it for himself years ago. The external calls grew more frequent, circling the cabin. The grizzly inside responded each time, positioning itself like a guard at the entrance. Jake realized he was witnessing something remarkable. The wounded bear was defending the cabin, and by extension, him. Minutes stretched into an hour. The calls from outside gradually faded, moving away into the storm's fury. The bear remained vigilant until the only sounds were wind and snow against the walls. Finally, it turned back into the cabin, its dark eyes finding Jake in his corner. They stared at each other across the firelit space. Jake had looked into the eyes of enemies before, searching for intent, for the moment before violence erupted. But this was different. The bear's gaze held intelligence, assessment, and something that might have been recognition, not of Jake specifically, but of what he was. Another creature that had chosen isolation, another refugee from a world that had proven too harsh. Slowly, carefully, Jake reached into his jacket pocket. The bear tensed but didn't move as Jake withdrew a piece of jerky. He tossed it gently onto the floor between them. The offering lay there for a long moment before the grizzly approached and sniffed it. One massive paw pinned the meat, while powerful jaws made quick work of it. Jake threw another piece, this time a little closer to himself. The bear hesitated, then approached again. As it ate, Jake could see the infection in its wounds more clearly. The edges were red and swollen, the kind of damage that would kill slowly if left untreated. His field medic training kicked in unbidden. He'd treated worse wounds on soldiers in the field, though never on anything this large or potentially lethal. The bear needed help, and despite everything his rational mind told him, Jake found himself considering the impossible. The storm raged on outside, trapping them together, two wounded souls who had chosen the mountains over the complications of civilization. The bear settled back down by the fire, but closer to Jake this time, close enough that he could smell the wild musk of its fur and hear the subtle wheeze in its breathing. Tomorrow, if they both survived the night, Jake would have decisions to make. For now he closed his eyes and listened to the storm, acutely aware that everything about his carefully constructed isolation had just changed forever. The bear's breathing deepened into sleep, and gradually Jake allowed himself to do the same. The bear's breathing had changed. What started as ragged, panicked gasps had settled into something deeper, more controlled. Marcus watched from his position by the overturned table, noting how the massive animal's dark eyes tracked his every movement with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. This wasn't the mindless fury of a cornered beast anymore. This was calculation. He'd seen that look before, in the mountains of Afghanistan. The split second when a predator shifted from defensive to offensive, when survival instinct gave way to something far more dangerous. His fingers tightened around the handle of his skinning knife, muscle memory flooding back, despite 3 years of trying to forget. The grizzly's head swiveled toward the kitchen, nostrils flaring. Marcus followed its gaze and cursed under his breath. Blood. His blood, from where he'd cut his palm on broken glass, was leaving a crimson trail across the floorboards. The metallic scent hung in the air between them like a dinner bell. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside, the world had narrowed to this 15-foot space and the deadly mathematics of predator versus prey. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. The bear was massive, easily 7 feet tall even on all fours, probably pushing 800 pounds. Its winter coat was thick and dark, marred by old scars that spoke of a life spent fighting for survival. One ear was torn, hanging at an odd angle, a survivor just like him. But unlike him, it hadn't chosen this isolation. The thought struck him with unexpected force. This wasn't some random encounter. Bears should be hibernating, not crashing through cabin doors in the middle of a whiteout. Something had driven this animal from its den, forced it into the storm. Something had made it desperate enough to seek shelter in a human dwelling. The grizzly shifted its weight, and Marcus tensed, but instead of charging, it simply repositioned itself closer to the fireplace, where the dying flames still threw off precious heat. The animal's massive frame shuddered, and for the first time, Marcus noticed the patches of ice clinging to its fur, the way it favored its left front paw. Hypothermia. The bear was suffering from exposure, just as he would have been if he'd stayed outside much longer. Marcus found himself studying the animal with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to assess wounded soldiers. The bear was in rough shape, but not critical, not yet. The question was whether he could keep it that way without getting himself killed in the process. A log in the fireplace collapsed, sending sparks up the chimney and casting dancing shadows across the walls. The grizzly's head snapped toward the sound, then back to Marcus, who had used the distraction to shift slightly toward the kitchen. Bad move, The bear's lips pulled back in a warning snarl, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. The message was clear: stay put. Marcus froze, raising his empty hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The knife remained hidden against his leg, but he could feel the weight of it, the familiar balance that had once meant the difference between life and death in a dozen different firefights. But this wasn't combat. This was something else entirely. The bear's snarl faded as Marcus remained motionless. Slowly, deliberately, the animal lowered its massive head and began to groom its injured paw, pink tongue working methodically to remove ice and debris from between its claws. The simple, domestic gesture hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a creature fighting for its life, and it was taking time to tend its wounds, just trying to survive another day in a world that seemed determined to kill it. He knew that feeling. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the storm outside and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Marcus found himself cataloguing details without conscious thought, the way the bear's breathing had steadied, how it kept one eye on him even while grooming, the subtle shift in its posture that suggested exhaustion rather than aggression. The animal was running on empty, just like he had been before it crashed through his door. Two survivors, thrown together by circumstance and a storm that showed no signs of letting up. The fire guttered lower, and the temperature in the cabin began to drop noticeably. Soon, the choice would be made for both of them: work together to maintain the heat or freeze separately. Marcus suspected the bear understood this equation as well as he did. He thought about the emergency radio in the kitchen, the supplies stored throughout the cabin, the spare blankets and food that could mean survival for both of them. But all of that required movement, cooperation, trust. The grizzly finished with its paw and settled into a more comfortable position, massive bulk blocking half the room. Its eyes never left Marcus, but the killing tension had faded from the air. Now came the hardest part, deciding whether to fight the darkness or learn to live with it. The grizzly's breathing had steadied into a rhythm that spoke of deep exhaustion rather than death. Each exhale sent small clouds of vapor into the frigid cabin air, and Jake found himself unconsciously matching the bear's respiratory pattern as he worked by lamplight to assess the damage to both his home and his unexpected guest. The tranquilizer dart protruded from the bear's thick shoulder like an accusatory finger pointing at Jake's past. He'd hoped never to see another one of those green-fletched sedatives again, but muscle memory had guided his hands to the emergency kit he'd sworn he'd never touch. The same hands that had once tracked poachers through the Yukon wilderness now trembled slightly as he approached the unconscious giant. "What the hell were you running from, big guy?" Jake whispered, noting the fresh scratches along the bear's flanks and the way its massive paws were scraped raw. This wasn't normal behavior. Grizzlies denned for winter, they didn't go crashing through human habitations in the middle of blizzards unless something had driven them to desperation. He pulled on his heaviest coat and stepped outside, immediately regretting the decision as the wind drove snow into his face like frozen needles. The storm had intensified, but Jake could still make out the depression in the snow where the bear had charged toward his cabin. Following the trail backward, he discovered something that made his blood run colder than the mountain air. Bootprints. Human bootprints. Partially filled with snow but still visible in the lee of a fallen log. Someone else was out here, and they'd been tracking the bear. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Illegal hunters, researchers, or worse, people from his old life who'd somehow found him. He'd chosen this mountain precisely because it was unmarked on most maps, accessible only by a treacherous trail that few people knew existed. Yet someone had followed the bear up here, and that meant they'd probably seen his cabin. Back inside, he found the grizzly beginning to stir. The massive head lifted slightly, unfocused eyes blinking in the lamplight. Jake retreated to the far wall, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he'd propped nearby. The bear's gaze found him across the small space, and for a moment, predator and man regarded each other in perfect stillness. Then the grizzly tried to stand and immediately collapsed. the tranquilizer still heavy in its system. It huffed in frustration, a sound so deeply human in its annoyance that Jake almost smiled, despite the surreal danger of his situation. "Take it easy," he said softly, using the same tone he'd once employed to calm wounded animals in his ranger days. "You're safe for now, but we both know that drug's going to wear off soon." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and Jake was struck by the intelligence in those dark eyes. This wasn't just any grizzly. This was an old male, scarred and wise, probably the dominant bear in this territory. Something significant had driven him from his den, and Jake had a growing certainty that whatever it was would soon be his problem too. A distant crack echoed through the storm, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. Jake moved to the window, peering through the gap in his makeshift barricade. Nothing visible through the snow, but someone was out there, moving carefully, trying to stay quiet, but making the small mistakes that came with cold and fatigue. The grizzly heard it too, its ears swiveling toward the sound. A low growl rumbled from deep in its chest, and Jake saw the bear's muscles tense despite the sedative coursing through its system. Whatever was approaching, the grizzly recognized it as a threat. Jake made a decision that his rational mind immediately questioned. Moving slowly, he approached the bear and knelt just outside its reach. "I don't know what they did to you," he whispered, "but they're not getting either of us tonight." He spent the next few minutes reinforcing his barricade, using furniture and spare lumber to create a more substantial barrier. The work warmed him despite the cold air streaming through gaps in his damaged door, and he found himself falling into the old patterns of tactical thinking he'd tried so hard to abandon. Field of fire from the windows, escape routes through the back of the cabin, inventory of weapons and ammunition. The skills were still there, sharp as ever despite years of disuse. But now, he wasn't just protecting himself. He had an 800-pound partner who might eat him the moment the drugs wore off completely. Another sound from outside, closer this time, deliberate footsteps crunching through snow. Jake checked his rifle and settled into position by the window, the grizzly's steady breathing behind him, a strange comfort in the growing darkness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The bear's breathing had steadied into a rhythm that Marcus found oddly comforting. 3 days had passed since the initial chaos, and an uneasy truce had settled over the cabin. The grizzly remained in the corner near the fireplace, its massive form taking up nearly a quarter of the living space, while Marcus had claimed the opposite end, using overturned furniture as a makeshift barrier. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Through the gaps in his boarded windows, Marcus could see nothing but white fury. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, rattling the cabin's bones and reminding him why the old-timers had named this place Devil's Ridge. His water situation was becoming critical. The bear had knocked over his main storage barrel during its dramatic entrance, and what hadn't soaked into the floorboards had quickly frozen. Marcus had been melting snow in a small pot over the fire, but it was a slow process that yielded precious little. Worse, he'd have to venture outside soon to gather more snow, and he wasn't sure how his unwelcome guest would react to being left alone. The grizzly stirred, raising its enormous head to watch Marcus move about the cabin. Those dark eyes tracked his every movement with an intelligence that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't the vacant stare of a purely wild animal. There was something almost calculating in that gaze, as if the bear were studying him, learning his patterns. Marcus tested his theory by reaching slowly toward his pack. The bear's ears immediately swiveled forward, alert. When Marcus pulled out a strip of jerky, the grizzly's nostrils flared, but it made no aggressive move. Instead, it simply watched as Marcus chewed the dried meat, its head tilting slightly as if considering something. "You're hungry too, aren't you?" Marcus said quietly. The sound of his own voice after hours of silence was startling. The bear's ears twitched at the words. Against every survival instinct screaming in his head, Marcus tore off a piece of jerky and tossed it halfway between them. The bear regarded the offering for a long moment, then rose with surprising grace for something so massive. Marcus pressed himself against the far wall, but the grizzly simply padded to the jerky, sniffed it once, and consumed it with a delicate precision that seemed almost polite. The interaction sparked a memory Marcus had been trying to suppress. Afghanistan, outside Kandahar. A wounded Taliban fighter they'd found in a collapsed building, half dead from blood loss. Marcus's squad leader had wanted to leave him, but something in the man's eyes, that same calculating intelligence he saw in the bear, had made Marcus risk precious medical supplies to stabilize him. The fighter had later provided intelligence that saved a convoy from an IED attack. Sometimes the enemy wasn't really the enemy. Sometimes survival meant making impossible alliances. The bear settled back into its corner, but closer this time. Only 10 feet separated them now instead of 15. Marcus found himself studying the creature more carefully. The wound on its shoulder was healing well, no longer seeping. Its coat, while matted in places, showed the healthy thickness of an animal that had been thriving before whatever had driven it to his door. As afternoon shadows crept across the cabin floor, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed insane a week ago. He moved to the window and began pulling away some of the boards he'd hastily nailed up. The bear watched intently as grey light filtered into the space. "Look," Marcus said, pointing outside. "See that? We're both trapped here." The grizzly's head turned toward the window, and for a moment Marcus could swear the animal understood. The storm outside was a common enemy, more dangerous to both of them than they were to each other. His radio crackled to life for the first time in days, making them both freeze. A weather service broadcast, automated and distant, blizzard conditions continuing through Thursday, with wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour. Emergency services suspended. Residents advised to shelter in place. Thursday. That was still 3 days away. As if responding to the news, the bear let out a low rumble that wasn't quite a growl. It sounded almost like frustration. Marcus knew exactly how it felt. His supplies would last, barely, but sharing space with 800 pounds of grizzly for 3 more days would push both of them to their limits. The temperature was dropping as evening approached. Marcus fed more wood to the fire, acutely aware that his fuel was also running low. The bear shifted closer to the warmth, and Marcus didn't retreat this time. Heat was another resource they'd have to share. Outside, something crashed against the cabin, a tree branch or piece of debris caught in the wind. Both man and bear turned toward the sound, and in that moment of shared alertness, Marcus realized they'd crossed some invisible threshold. They were no longer predator and prey, or even reluctant roommates. They were survivors, and the mountain was testing them both. The bear's breathing had steadied into a deep, rhythmic pattern that told Marcus he'd made the right call. The makeshift splint held firm against the animal's massive foreleg, and the bleeding had stopped. But as dawn crept through the shattered doorframe, painting everything in pale grey light, Marcus realized his problems were just beginning. The storm still raged outside with unrelenting fury. Snow had drifted 3 feet high against what remained of his door, sealing them both inside like prisoners. The cabin's temperature had dropped barely above freezing, and his firewood supply wouldn't last another day with the gaping hole where his entrance used to be. Marcus studied the bear's face in the growing light. Even unconscious, there was something unsettlingly familiar about the creature's scars, long, deliberate marks that spoke of human cruelty rather than natural conflict. The military tattoo on his forearm seemed to pulse with phantom heat as memories he'd spent 5 years burying clawed their way to the surface. Afghanistan, the research facility, Project Ursus. He shook his head violently, forcing the thoughts away. That life was dead and buried. This was just a wounded animal seeking shelter, nothing more. The bear stirred, one amber eye opening to fix on Marcus with startling intelligence. Instead of the rage he expected, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. "Easy," Marcus whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his belt. "Easy, big guy." The grizzly's massive head lifted slightly, studying Marcus with an intensity that felt almost human. Then, impossibly, the bear's posture shifted, The aggressive tension melted away, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like relief. Marcus's satellite phone buzzed from across the room. He'd forgotten about it in the chaos of the night. Moving slowly, never taking his eyes off the bear, he retrieved the device. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, and a text message that made his hands shake. "We know you have Asset 7. Extraction team en route. Do not interfere. Colonel Hayes." The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Asset 7. The designation hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back to sterile laboratory corridors and the sound of cages rattling in underground bunkers. The bear, Asset 7, watched him with those 2 intelligent eyes, and Marcus saw understanding there. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't just a wild animal seeking shelter. Somehow, impossibly, one of them had found him. His mind raced through the implications. The facility was supposed to have been shut down, the subjects relocated, or he couldn't finish that thought. But if Hayes was still running operations, if the project had continued after Marcus's discharge, then everything he'd believed about his escape from that life was a lie. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the storm's howl, still distant but growing closer. Marcus's training kicked in automatically, his body moving before his mind caught up. He grabbed his tactical pack from beneath his bed, muscle memory guiding him to weapons and gear he'd hoped never to touch again. Asset 7. He refused to think of the bear by that designation, struggled to stand. The splint held, but the animal's movements were still labored. Those amber eyes tracked Marcus's preparations with obvious concern. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" Marcus said quietly. "After all this time, they're still coming." The bear huffed once, almost like acknowledgement. Marcus made his decision. Whatever the creature had been forced to endure, whatever experiments they'd performed, he wouldn't let Hayes drag him back. Not without a fight. He moved to his weapons cache, a hidden compartment built into the cabin's north wall. Inside were tools from his former life: compact assault rifle, tactical gear, enough ammunition for a small war. His fingers closed around familiar grips, and for a moment he was Sergeant Marcus Chen again, Special Forces operator, instead of the hermit he'd tried to become. The helicopter sound grew louder. Through the storm, he could make out the distinctive whoop-whoop of military rotors. Hayes hadn't wasted time. "Can you move?" he asked the bear. "Because if we're going to get out of this, we need to go now." Asset 7 pushed himself upright, favoring his injured leg, but managing to stand. The animal was massive, easily 8 feet tall and 600 pounds, but moved with surprising grace despite his wounds. Marcus shouldered his pack and checked his rifle. The back window offered their only exit route. Beyond it lay the tree line and a maze of mountain paths he knew better than any extraction team. 5 years, he muttered, chambering around. 5 years of peace, and you had to show up on my doorstep. The bear looked at him, and Marcus could have sworn he saw an apology in those ancient eyes. The helicopter was close now, maybe 2 minutes out. Marcus opened the back window, frigid air rushing in to mix with the cabin's already freezing atmosphere. "Come on then," he said grimly. "Let's go disappoint some old friends." The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt almost sacred. Marcus stood at the threshold of his shattered doorway, watching Kodiak lumber toward the tree line with surprising grace for such a massive creature. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, turning back once as if to acknowledge their strange partnership, before disappearing into the snow-laden pines. Marcus's breath came in visible puffs as he surveyed the destruction. His sanctuary, carefully built over 3 years of isolation, lay in ruins. Splintered wood from the doorframe jutted at odd angles, and bear tracks the size of dinner plates marked a chaotic path through what had once been his orderly living space. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fled civilization to escape violence, only to have violence crash through his door in the form of 800 pounds of wounded grizzly. He pressed his palm against the claw marks on his shoulder, feeling the warm stickiness of blood through his torn flannel. The wounds weren't deep, but they served as a stark reminder of how close he'd come to joining the scattered remains of his furniture. More unsettling was how naturally his old training had surfaced when death came calling. His hands had moved with practiced precision, his mind calculating angles and vulnerabilities even as terror flooded his system. The broken radio crackled from beneath an overturned table, its antenna bent at an unnatural angle. Marcus pulled it free and examined the damage. The battery compartment had been crushed, and the display screen showed spiderweb fractures across its surface. His only connection to the outside world severed as completely as the phone lines the storm had undoubtedly brought down. He began the methodical task of salvaging what he could. Canned goods had rolled into corners, their labels torn but contents intact. His medical kit, thank God, had survived in its metal box, though the lid bore fresh dents. As he worked, his mind wandered to the bear's eyes, not the wild fury he'd expected, but something closer to exhaustion, even desperation. The trap wound had been severe, nearly to the bone. Someone had set steel-jawed leg-hold traps in these mountains, illegal for decades but still used by poachers who didn't care about conservation laws. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd seen what those traps could do to a creature, the way they bit and held, causing infection and slow death if not removed. A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps, but not the heavy padding of bear paws. These were deliberate, measured, human boots crunching through snow. Marcus moved to the window, staying low as he peered through the frost-etched glass. 3 figures emerged from the forest, moving in a tactical formation that made his blood run cold. They wore white winter camouflage and carried rifles with practiced ease. The lead man gestured to the others, pointing at the obvious trail of destruction leading from Marcus's cabin into the woods. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the predatory alertness in their movements. These weren't lost hikers or park rangers. He recognized the type immediately: mercenaries, probably hired by someone with enough money to outfit a private hunting expedition, the kind of men who set illegal traps and tracked wounded animals until they could claim their trophy. His isolation had been discovered, and these weren't the kind of visitors who knocked politely. Marcus retreated deeper into the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities. The back window was too small for a quick escape, and the front door gaped open like an invitation. His hunting rifle hung on pegs near the fireplace, but reaching it would put him in direct line of sight from outside. The lead hunter raised his hand, stopping his companions about 50 yards from the cabin. Marcus caught fragments of conversation carried on the wind, something about tracking the bear, about cleaning up loose ends. His stomach dropped as understanding hit him. They'd seen his intervention with Kodiak. A hermit who could free a massive grizzly from a steel trap and live to tell about it was a witness they couldn't afford to leave breathing. He thought of Kodiak, somewhere in the forest nursing his wounds. The bear had no idea that danger followed his trail, that his brief sanctuary in Marcus's cabin had marked them both for death. The cruel irony cut deep. Marcus had spent 3 years avoiding the violence of his past, only to have it track him down through an act of mercy. The hunters began moving again, spreading out to surround the cabin. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of decisions he'd hoped never to make again. His reflections stared back from the broken radio screen, no longer the peaceful hermit who'd chopped wood and watched sunsets, but something harder, more dangerous. The mountain had taught him that survival sometimes demanded becoming the very thing you'd tried to escape. As Boots approached his ruined door, Marcus reached for his rifle and prepared to remember who he used to be. The grizzly's breathing had steadied, but Kai could feel the fever burning through its massive frame. He'd managed to clean the infected wounds on its shoulder and flank, revealing the true extent of the damage. 3 deep gashes ran parallel across the bear's left side, too precise to be from another animal, too clean. These were blade marks. Someone had tortured this creature. Kai's hands trembled as he prepared another poultice, memories threatening to surface like ice cracking under pressure. He'd seen wounds like these before, in places he'd sworn to forget. Places where men did unspeakable things to extract information, to break spirits, to satisfy twisted curiosities about pain thresholds. The bear's eyes tracked his movements, intelligent and weary. There was something almost human in that gaze, a recognition that seemed to pierce straight through to Kai's soul, as if it knew exactly who he used to be. Outside, the blizzard had intensified, turning the world into a howling void of white. Even if he wanted to leave, even if every instinct screamed at him to run, there was nowhere to go. The storm had them both trapped in this fragile sanctuary. He pressed the herbal mixture against the bear's wounds, expecting resistance. Instead, the massive creature remained perfectly still, trusting him with a vulnerability that made Kai's chest tighten. When had anyone last trusted him like this? When had he deserved such faith? The radio crackled to life, making them both freeze. Base to Alpine 7. Repeat, base to Alpine 7. Target has been located, converging on grid reference Tango 47. Kai's blood turned to ice. Alpine 7. Military designation, grid references. They weren't just looking for the bear anymore. The coordinates they'd given were less than 2 miles from his position. The bear's ears swiveled toward the radio, a low rumble building in its chest. It understood danger in any language. Copy that, base. Visual confirmation on the cabin. Single structure, smoke visible. Orders? Maintain position. Do not engage until full team arrival. Subject is considered extremely dangerous. Subject. They weren't talking about the bear now. Kai's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. How had they found him? He'd been so careful, so thorough in erasing his tracks. 5 years of perfect invisibility shattered in a single night. The bear tried to rise, instinct driving it toward the door despite its injuries. Kai placed a firm hand on its shoulder, feeling the incredible power coiled beneath fur and muscle. Easy, he whispered. We're not going anywhere in this storm. But even as he said it, Kai knew they couldn't stay. The storm would pass, and when it did, they'd come. Men with equipment and training and orders to bring him back to a world he'd fought so hard to escape. Men who would finish what someone had started with the bear. He moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. Nothing but swirling white, but somewhere in that chaos eyes were watching, waiting. The bear had struggled to its feet, swaying but upright. Blood seeped through the bandages, but its eyes burned with fierce determination. It moved to stand beside Kai at the window, 2 unlikely allies bound by circumstance and survival. You know they're out there too, don't you? Kai murmured. The bear's presence beside him was oddly comforting, a solid wall of strength in a world suddenly full of threats. He thought about the escape routes he'd mapped years ago, the contingency plans he'd hoped never to use. Most were impassable in this weather, but there was one possibility. A narrow canyon that led deeper into the wilderness, treacherous but navigable for someone who knew the terrain. The radio crackled again. Weather update, storm clearing faster than anticipated. ETA to full clearing, 40 minutes. Repeat, 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Kai felt the familiar calm descending, the cold clarity that had once made him so valuable to people he now despised. His survival training kicked in, suppressing emotion in favor of calculated action. He began gathering supplies, medical kit, ammunition, emergency rations, enough to survive but light enough to move fast. The bear watched his preparations with keen intelligence, as if understanding that their fates were now intertwined. I don't know why someone did this to you, Kai said softly, checking the wounds one final time. But I know why they're coming for me, and I won't let them take either of us. The bear's response was a low chuff that might have been agreement. Kai extinguished the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. Through the storm's howl, he thought he heard the distant drone of engines, snowmobiles maybe, or worse. He shouldered his pack and moved to the back door, the bear limping beside him. The cold hit like a physical blow, but they pushed forward into the white hell beyond. Behind them, the warm safety of the cabin faded into memory. Ahead lay only the unknown darkness of the mountains and the slim hope that two broken souls might find redemption in the wilderness. The bear's breathing had grown shallow, each exhale a whispered reminder of how fragile the boundary between life and death truly was. Elias sat cross-legged beside the massive form, watching the rise and fall of fur that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past 3 days. The cabin felt smaller somehow, not because of the grizzly's physical presence, but because of the weight of responsibility that pressed against the walls. Outside, the blizzard had finally begun to exhaust itself. The howling that had been their constant companion was now reduced to occasional gusts that rattled the windows like restless spirits. Through the frost-covered glass, Elias could make out the first hints of grey dawn struggling through the storm clouds. He'd managed to clean and dress the bear's wounds properly, using techniques he'd hoped never to employ again. The deep gashes along its flank had required careful suturing with fishing line, primitive but effective. The infected claw marks on its shoulder had been the real challenge, forcing him to lance and drain the pocket of infection that had been slowly poisoning the animal's system. Each procedure had been a negotiation between his steady hands and the bear's surprising tolerance for his ministrations. The grizzly stirred, and Elias found himself holding his breath. Those dark eyes opened, fixing on him with an intelligence that continued to unnerve him. There was no fear there, no wild panic that should have accompanied a predator finding itself in such close quarters with a human. Instead, there was something that looked disturbingly like recognition. "You know me, don't you?" Elias whispered, his voice hoarse from days of silence broken only by the storm. "But that's impossible." The bear's massive head shifted slightly, and Elias could swear he saw the ghost of acknowledgement in those eyes. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold seeping through the cabin walls. Rising stiffly, Elias moved to the window and scraped away enough frost to peer outside. The world beyond was a monochrome landscape of white and grey, sculpted by wind into impossible formations. Snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall, nearly reaching the bottom of the window frame. But the worst had passed. By afternoon, maybe evening, he might be able to venture outside. The question was, what then? Behind him, he heard the bear attempting to shift position. Elias turned to see the animal struggling to lift its head, muscles trembling with the effort. Without thinking, he moved to help, sliding his arm under the massive skull and providing support. The bear allowed this assistance without resistance, settling into a more comfortable position with what sounded remarkably like a sigh of relief. "This is insane," Elias muttered, but he didn't pull away. The warmth radiating from the bear's body was oddly comforting, a reminder that life persisted even in the harshest circumstances. His mind wandered to the radio equipment gathering dust in the storage room. 3 days ago, he would have used it to call for help the moment the storm cleared. Wildlife services, forest rangers, someone to deal with this impossible situation. But now the thought of strangers invading this space, of tranquilizer guns and transport cages, felt like a betrayal. The bear's stomach rumbled audibly, and Elias realized he'd been so focused on treating injuries that he'd barely considered the animal's other needs. His own supplies were running low, another concern that would need addressing once the weather cleared. But what did you feed a recovering grizzly? His knowledge of bear dietary requirements was theoretical at best. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing his patient, Elias made his way to the kitchen area and surveyed his remaining stores. Canned salmon, dried fruits, nuts, honey. It wasn't much, but it might suffice until the bear could hunt for itself again. If it could hunt for itself again. As he opened a can of salmon, the rich scent filled the cabin. Behind him, the bear's breathing changed, becoming more alert. Elias spooned the fish into a metal bowl and approached cautiously. "Easy now," he said, setting the bowl within reach of the bear's muzzle. "Let's see if you can keep this down." The grizzly sniffed the offering, then began to eat with surprising delicacy for such a massive creature. Each bite was careful, measured, as if the animal understood its own fragile state. Watching this display of what seemed like conscious restraint, Elias felt another piece of his rational worldview crumble away. When the bowl was empty, the bear settled back with a contented rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Its eyes found Elias again, and this time he didn't look away. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible connection had formed between them, he was past the point of denial. The storm was ending, but their story was just beginning. The bear's breathing had steadied into a rhythm that matched the wind outside. Caleb found himself synchronizing his own breaths with theirs, an unconscious mimicry that seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders. The morphine had done its work. The massive grizzly lay still, chest rising and falling in peaceful waves, while Caleb worked by lamplight to clean and dress the wounds. 3 days had passed since the surgery. 3 days of this strange coexistence that defied everything he thought he knew about predator and prey, about fear and trust. The bear's eyes followed him now when he moved around the cabin, not with the wild fury of that first night, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. Caleb had named her Ursa in his mind, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps because giving her a name made this surreal situation feel more manageable. Perhaps because, after 3 days of tending to her wounds, checking her temperature, and ensuring she had water, she had become something more than just a dangerous wild animal sharing his space. The radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. Marcus's voice cut through the static, urgent and strained. "Caleb, you there? We've got a problem." Caleb glanced at Ursa, who had lifted her massive head at the sound of the unfamiliar voice. He reached for the handset, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm here. What's going on?" Search and rescue picked up some chatter. "There's a team heading your way. 3 men, armed, asking questions about someone matching your description. They're not official, no badges, no paperwork, just cash and a lot of interest in finding you." The blood drained from Caleb's face. After all these years, after all his careful precautions, they had found him. The life he'd tried to bury in these mountains was clawing its way back to the surface. "How long do I have?" "Storm's been slowing them down, but they've got serious gear. Maybe 12 hours, maybe less. They're coming up the North Trail." Caleb's mind raced through possibilities. In 12 hours, in his condition, he might be able to make it to the emergency cache he'd hidden 2 miles east. But that would mean leaving Ursa behind, and in her current state, she wouldn't survive. The morphine would wear off, infection could set in, and without someone to monitor her recovery, she would die. Copy that. Thanks for the warning. Caleb, whoever these guys are, they mean business. Don't try to be a hero. The radio went silent. Caleb set down the handset and looked at Ursa, who was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. She seemed to sense his distress, a low rumble emanating from deep in her chest, not a threat, but something that sounded almost like concern. He had 2 choices: run and save himself, or stay and face whatever consequences his past had finally delivered to his doorstep. A year ago, the decision would have been simple. Survival meant escape, and sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. But something had changed during these 3 days. Maybe it was the way Ursa had trusted him enough to let him treat her wounds. Maybe it was the strange peace that had settled over the cabin, despite the presence of one of nature's most formidable predators. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of running from who he used to be. Caleb moved to his equipment cache and began pulling out items he hadn't touched in years. The tactical vest still fit, though it felt foreign against his chest. The Sig Sauer felt both familiar and alien in his hands as he checked the action and loaded a fresh magazine. Muscle memory kicked in as he assembled the rest of his gear: night vision scope, flashbang grenades, the specialized knife that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. Ursa watched these preparations with growing alertness. As if, sensing the change in him, the shift from caregiver back to the soldier he'd once been, she struggled to rise. Caleb moved quickly to her side, placing a gentle hand on her flank. "Easy, girl. You're not ready for that yet." She settled back down but remained watchful. There was an intelligence in her gaze that unnerved him, as if she understood exactly what was happening and was trying to decide whether he was still the same man who had saved her life. The wind outside began to die down, and Caleb knew that meant his pursuers would make better time. He checked his watch, 4 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, but that wouldn't matter much. These men would have thermal imaging, night vision, all the toys that money could buy. He made his final preparations as Ursa watched from her makeshift bed. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just his fate, but hers as well. The man who had retreated to these mountains to escape his past was about to discover that some battles follow you no matter how far you run. The only question now was whether Marcus Chen still remembered how to fight. The radio crackled to life, just as dawn broke over the mountains, its static-filled voice cutting through the cabin's morning stillness. Marcus jerked awake from where he dozed in the chair beside Kodiak's makeshift bed, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle before he recognized the sound. "This is search and rescue calling any survivors in the Devil's Canyon area. Please respond if you can hear this transmission." Marcus stared at the ancient emergency radio he'd forgotten was even there, buried under supplies in the back corner. The storm must have finally cleared enough for signals to penetrate the valley. He glanced at Kodiak, whose massive chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. The bear's condition had stabilized overnight, but barely. "This is Marcus Webb," he said into the handset, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm at the old ranger station cabin. Coordinates approximately—" "Marcus Webb?" The voice sharpened with recognition. "Sir, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen with Alpine Search and Rescue. We've been looking for you for 3 days. Are you injured?" 3 days. The blizzard had stolen more time than he'd realized. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the outside world pressing against the sanctuary he'd built in these mountains. "I'm uninjured, but I have a situation here that requires immediate veterinary assistance." "Copy that. We can have a team to you within the hour. What's your medical emergency?" Marcus looked at Kodiak again, remembering the moment the great bear had collapsed, the trust in those dark eyes as Marcus had worked to save him. How could he explain that the grizzly wasn't just an animal anymore, but something closer to salvation? Grizzly bear with severe lacerations and possible internal injuries. "He's been here for 4 days. Static filled the silence that followed. When Chen's voice returned, it carried a different tone. "Sir, did you say you're treating a grizzly bear?" "That's correct. Mr. Webb, we're going to need you to secure that animal immediately, for everyone's safety, including yours." Marcus felt his jaw clench. The familiar sensation of authority figures making decisions about situations they didn't understand brought back memories he'd spent years burying. Military briefings where bureaucrats dictated rules of engagement to soldiers who lived with the consequences. "The bear isn't a threat," Marcus said carefully. "He's unconscious and critically injured. Sir, we have protocols. No rescue team can approach with an active grizzly in the vicinity." Through the window, Marcus could already see the distant speck of a helicopter working its way up the valley. Soon there would be people here, strangers with their procedures and safety regulations and forms to fill out. They would see only a dangerous wild animal and a hermit who'd lost his mind. But they hadn't seen Kodiak lumber through the blizzard, choosing this cabin over dozens of other shelters. They hadn't felt the bear's massive paw rest trustingly in human hands while infection raged through his body. They hadn't watched him fight for every breath with the same determination Marcus had once seen in wounded soldiers who refused to give up. "Lieutenant Chen," Marcus said, switching to the command voice that had once led men through impossible missions. "I'm a former Army Ranger with extensive field medical training. The animal is secured and poses no threat in his current condition. Your team can approach safely. Mr. Webb, I understand your background, but—" Marcus clicked off the radio and pulled the battery pack free. He needed time to think before they arrived, time to figure out how to protect Kodiak from people who would see only the danger, not the soul. Moving to the bear's side, he knelt and placed a hand on the great head. Kodiak's breathing had grown steadier through the night, and the fever seemed to have broken. But he was still weak. still vulnerable. "I won't let them hurt you," Marcus whispered. "But I need you to wake up, old friend. I need you to show them what I see." The sound of rotor blades grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus stood and began quickly organizing his medical supplies, creating a professional-looking treatment area that might convince the rescue team he knew what he was doing. He pulled on his old military jacket, its faded patches and medals still visible despite years of mountain weather. When he caught his reflection in the cabin window, he barely recognized himself. The hermit was gone, replaced by the soldier he'd once been, straight-backed, alert, ready for battle. But this wasn't a fight against enemy forces or hostile terrain. This was something far more complex, a battle to bridge two worlds that had never been meant to coexist. The civilized world of regulations and safety protocols, and the wild world where a man and a bear could find healing in each other's unlikely companionship. The helicopter's shadow passed over the cabin as it circled for landing. Marcus took a deep breath, touched Kodiak's flank once more for luck, and prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. The bear's breathing had grown labored during the night, each exhale a raspy wheeze that cut through the cabin's silence. Marcus sat hunched beside the massive form, his fingers pressed against the thick fur of Goliath's neck, feeling the irregular pulse beneath. The fever had spiked again, and despite everything he'd done, infection was winning the battle. Dawn light filtered through the frost-covered windows, revealing the harsh reality he'd been avoiding. The antibiotics from his medical kit were nearly gone, and what remained wouldn't be enough. The bear needed veterinary care, real medicine, not the field surgery and wilderness remedies that had barely kept him alive this long. Marcus stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of maintaining vigil. The radio crackled to life from the corner where he'd left it, Sarah's voice cutting through the static. "Marcus, are you there? The storm's breaking up. We can have a team to you by noon." He stared at the radio, then at Goliath. The bear's massive chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns. Making contact meant exposing himself, bringing his carefully constructed isolation to an end. But letting Goliath die meant abandoning the one thing that had given his exile meaning. "Sarah," his voice came out hoarse from disuse and emotion. "I need a veterinarian, large animal experience, and bring everything you have for treating infection in wildlife." The silence stretched so long he wondered if the connection had failed. Then, "Marcus? Jesus, we thought you were dead. What do you mean a veterinarian? There's a grizzly here, injured. He needs help I can't give him." "A grizzly? Marcus, get away from that thing. We'll be there soon and—" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "He's not dangerous, not anymore. Just bring the vet." He clicked off before she could respond, knowing the questions would only complicate things. Through the window, he could see the storm clouds breaking apart, patches of blue sky visible between the grey masses. The blizzard that had brought Goliath to his door was finally ending. The bear stirred, amber eyes opening to fix on Marcus with an intelligence that still unnerved him. There was recognition there, and something deeper. Trust, maybe, or simply resignation. Goliath's massive head lifted slightly, then fell back to the makeshift bedding. "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I'm scared too." He spent the next hour preparing, cleaning the cabin, and gathering what few possessions mattered to him. The life he'd built here was ending. He could feel it in his bones. Whatever came next, there would be questions, scrutiny, people wanting to understand how a hermit had survived. Alone, with an injured grizzly for 3 days. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, echoing off the mountainsides. Marcus stepped outside, squinting against the glare of sun on fresh snow. The aircraft circled once before finding a clear spot to land 50 yards from the cabin, its downdraft whipping snow into miniature tornadoes. 4 figures emerged, Sarah, bundling herself against the cold despite her heavy parka, 2 men in ranger uniforms he didn't recognize, and a woman carrying what was obviously a veterinary field kit. They approached cautiously, Sarah in the lead. "Marcus," Her voice carried a mixture of relief and wariness. "You look like hell." "Good to see you too." He gestured toward the cabin. "The bear's inside. He's weak. Probably won't react to strangers, but move slow anyway." The veterinarian, a compact woman with graying hair, stepped forward. "Dr. Elena Vasquez. I specialize in large predator medicine. Can you tell me about his injuries?" Marcus led them toward the cabin, explaining the initial wounds, the surgery he'd performed, the progression of infection. Dr. Vasquez listened without comment, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "You operated on a conscious grizzly bear?" one of the rangers interrupted. "Are you insane?" "He was dying," Marcus said simply. "So was I, probably." They reached the cabin door and Marcus paused, his hand on the latch. "He saved my life first. Remember that." Inside, Goliath lay motionless except for his labored breathing. Dr. Vasquez whistled low under her breath. "That's a big boy. And you're right about the infection." She was already unpacking her kit, drawing medications into syringes. "Good news is, what you did probably saved him. Bad news is we need to get him to a proper facility." "How?" Sarah asked. "You can't exactly load a grizzly into a helicopter. Tranquilize him first, then we'll need a heavy lift chopper and a specialized transport cage." Dr. Vasquez looked at Marcus with newfound respect. "What you did here, keeping him alive this long, it's remarkable, but also impossible. Bears don't trust humans like this." Marcus watched as she administered the first injection, Goliath barely stirring at the needle's prick. Maybe he knew I needed saving too. Outside, the mountain wind was picking up again, but the storm was truly breaking. Soon, this place would be empty again, just another abandoned cabin slowly being reclaimed by wilderness. But something had changed here, something neither man nor beast would forget. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but the silence felt more ominous than the storm's fury. Ethan crouched beside the bear, watching the shallow rise and fall of her massive chest. The makeshift splint held, but infection was his greatest fear now. In the wilderness, a wounded animal was a dead animal, and he'd seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Kodiak, he'd started thinking of her by name, stirred as pale morning light filtered through the cabin's broken windows. Her dark eyes found his immediately, and he saw something there that made his breath catch. Recognition. Not the wild panic of a trapped animal, but the measured awareness of a creature choosing to trust. "Easy, girl," he murmured, staying perfectly still. "We're in this together now." The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 days ago he'd been content in his isolation, convinced that solitude was his only path to peace. Now he was nursing a grizzly bear back to health in his destroyed cabin, talking to her like she was an old friend. His therapist back in the city would have had a field day with this development. Kodiak's stomach rumbled audibly, and Ethan realized he needed to address the practical matter of feeding a 700-pound carnivore. His own food stores were running low, and the storm had likely scattered or buried any nearby game. He'd have to venture out, leave her alone, and trust that she'd still be here when he returned. The thought of leaving her vulnerable sent an unexpected pang through his chest. When had he started caring so much? He pulled on his jacket and boots, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "I'll be back," he said, feeling foolish for talking to a bear, but unable to stop himself. "Try not to redecorate while I'm gone." Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow reached nearly to his waist in some places, sculpted into impossible curves and peaks by the wind. The familiar landmarks of his territory had vanished beneath pristine white, making navigation treacherous. But Ethan had learned to read the mountain's moods long ago, and he set off toward the frozen creek where deer sometimes came to drink. The tracks told a story of desperation. Rabbits, foxes, even a lone wolf had passed this way, all searching for food in the aftermath of the storm, but it was the larger prints that made him freeze. Bear tracks, and recent ones. These weren't Kodiak's. She'd been in his cabin all night. Another bear, drawn perhaps by the scent of blood, had been circling his territory. Male grizzlies were notoriously aggressive toward wounded females, seeing them as competition for resources or territory. If this bear decided to investigate his cabin, Ethan quickened his pace, following the creek bed until he spotted movement ahead. A young elk had fallen through the ice and become trapped, its struggles growing weaker by the minute. In the old days, before his self-imposed exile, he would have tried to save it. Now, pragmatism won out. The elk was beyond help, but its death could mean life for Kodiak. The shot echoed across the valley, sharp and final. Ethan worked quickly, field-dressing the carcass and cutting away the choicest portions. The rest would have to stay here. He couldn't carry it all, and the scent of fresh meat might draw that other bear away from his cabin. By the time he returned, the sun had climbed high enough to set the snowfields blazing with reflected light. The cabin looked even more battered in daylight, its walls scarred by claw marks and its door hanging askew. But smoke still rose from the chimney, and that was what mattered. Kodiak lifted her head as he entered, nostrils flaring at the scent of fresh meat. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Feeding a wild predator went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned, but looking into those intelligent brown eyes, he realized that normal rules no longer applied. He placed the meat within her reach and watched as she ate, careful and methodical despite her obvious hunger. Her injured leg remained motionless, but her movement seemed stronger than yesterday. The fever had broken sometime during the night. "You're a fighter," he said softly. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." The afternoon passed quietly, both of them resting and recovering. Ethan found himself studying her, the intricate pattern of her fur, the way her ears swiveled to track sounds outside, the surprising delicacy with which she cleaned her massive paws. She was a masterpiece of evolution, perfectly adapted to survive in this harsh environment. As evening approached, he heard what he'd been dreading all day, the deep huffing grunt of another bear outside. The male had found them. Kodiak heard it too, her body tensing despite her injuries. She tried to rise, protective instincts overriding pain, but her broken leg buckled. Ethan reached for his rifle, then stopped. If he drove off the male with gunshots, it might only delay the inevitable. The bear would keep coming back, and eventually Ethan might not be here to stop him. Sometimes he'd learned long ago in darker places, the only way forward was through the danger, not around it. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the emerging sun. Marcus stood at the edge of the ravine, where he'd last seen Kodiak disappear into the swirling white, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 3 days had passed since the avalanche, and despite his methodical searches, he'd found nothing but broken trees and scattered debris. Sarah emerged from the partially rebuilt cabin, her arm still in a makeshift sling but moving with more confidence. "The radio's working," she called out. "Rescue teams are mobilizing, but it'll be at least another day before they can reach us with the helicopter." Marcus nodded without turning around. His eyes remained fixed on the treacherous slope below, calculating angles and snow depth. The logical part of his mind, the part trained in military precision, told him that nothing could have survived that avalanche. But something deeper, something that had awakened during these weeks with the great bear, refused to accept it. "He saved us," Marcus said quietly. "When the snow started coming down, he positioned himself between us and the slide. He knew." Sarah approached carefully, recognizing the tone in his voice. She'd seen this look before, during their darkest missions overseas, the expression of a man wrestling with impossible choices. "Marcus, you did everything you could. Without your skills, none of us would have made it through that storm." "My skills," he repeated, bitter irony creeping into his voice. "Do you know what my specialty was, Sarah? What they trained me to do?" She waited, sensing the weight of confession in his words. "Elimination of high-value targets in remote environments. I was a sniper, but more than that, I was a hunter. They taught me to track, to think like my prey, to understand the psychology of survival." His fists clenched, and when I couldn't handle it anymore, when the nightmares of all those kills started eating me alive, I ran. I came here to hide from what I'd become. The wind picked up, sending snow crystals dancing between them. Marcus turned to face her fully, and she saw the raw pain he'd been carrying. Then Kodiak crashed through my door, and everything changed. For the first time in years, I used those skills to preserve life instead of taking it. I learned to see the world through his eyes, to understand that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about choosing what's worth protecting. A distant sound made them both freeze. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakably organic. A low, rumbling groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Marcus was moving before conscious thought took over, grabbing the rope and rappelling gear they'd salvaged from his destroyed supplies. That came from the ravine. "Marcus, wait." Sarah caught his arm. "Even if he's alive down there, the snow could be unstable. One wrong move and you could trigger another slide." He paused, studying her face. The woman who'd once been his commanding officer, who'd led them through impossible odds in foreign territories, was asking him to abandon the search. But in her eyes he saw something else, not doubt in Kodiak's survival, but fear for his own safety. "I know the risks," he said simply, "but I also know what I owe him. Not just my life, but my sanity. My chance at redemption." Before she could protest further, another sound echoed from below, weaker this time, but definitely there. Marcus secured the rope around a sturdy pine and began his descent into the ravine. The snow here was deeper than he'd expected, some drifts reaching nearly to his chest. He moved slowly, testing each step, reading the subtle signs of stability and stress in the accumulated snow. 20 feet down he found the first sign, a patch of fur caught on a splintered branch, dark brown, almost black, with the distinctive silver-tipped guard hairs he'd grown so familiar with. His heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the sparse trail deeper into the ravine. The sound came again, closer now, and Marcus realized it wasn't quite what he'd expected. Not the robust growl of an active bear, but something more labored, more desperate. He rounded a massive boulder and stopped dead. Kodiak lay partially buried under a natural shelter formed by fallen trees and accumulated snow. The bear's massive form rose and fell with shallow breaths, and one rear leg was clearly damaged, bent at an unnatural angle. But his eyes, those intelligent dark eyes that had watched Marcus with such careful assessment, were alert and focused. The bear made no aggressive moves as Marcus approached, just that same low rumbling sound. Not a growl, Marcus realized with sudden clarity, but a greeting, a call for help from one survivor to another. "Easy, old friend," Marcus whispered, dropping to his knees in the snow. "I'm here. We're going to figure this out together." As he began assessing the bear's injuries with careful hands, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The guilt and self-hatred that had driven him into isolation weren't gone, but they'd transformed into something else. Purpose, determination, and an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of shared survival. The radio crackled to life as dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah's voice cutting through the static with urgent precision. "This is Ranger Station Alpha. We have confirmation of poachers operating in Sector 7, armed and dangerous. All units converge on coordinates." The transmission dissolved into white noise, but Marcus had heard enough. He glanced at Kodiak, who lay sprawled across half the cabin floor, his massive frame rising and falling with each breath. The bear's wounds had healed remarkably well over the past weeks, but the tranquilizer dart wound on his flank still showed pink beneath the dark fur. Marcus knew what the radio call meant. The men who had tortured this magnificent creature were still out there, still hunting. The storm had finally broken 3 days ago, leaving the world outside pristine and deceptively peaceful. Snow lay thick and undisturbed except for the tracks Marcus made during his daily reconnaissance. He'd been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. The poachers wouldn't give up easily, not with a bear like Kodiak representing such a prize in the illegal wildlife trade. Marcus reached for his pack, muscle memory guiding his hands to compartments he hadn't touched in years. The tactical gear felt foreign yet familiar, like slipping into an old skin he'd thought he'd shed forever. His fingers found the cold metal of weapons he'd sworn never to use again, tools that belonged to the soldier he'd been, not the hermit he'd become. Kodiak's eyes opened, those intelligent brown orbs tracking Marcus's movements with uncanny awareness. The bear had learned to read him over these weeks together, sensing his moods, his intentions. Now Kodiak rose slowly, shaking off sleep and moving to the window where he could see the tree line. "You know they're coming too, don't you, boy?" Marcus whispered, checking the action on his rifle. The weapon was perfectly maintained despite years of disuse, another habit from his military days that had never left him. "This time, we finish it." The radio crackled again, closer now, multiple voices coordinating search patterns, tightening the net. But these weren't rangers. The tactical language was wrong, too aggressive, too predatory. Marcus recognized the communication style of mercenaries, men who killed for money without the discipline of soldiers or the dedication of law enforcement. He made his decision with the cold clarity that had once made him an effective operator. The cabin had been sanctuary, but now it was a trap. They needed to move, to choose the ground for the confrontation that was coming. Marcus shouldered his pack and moved toward the door, but Kodiak was already there, pressing against the wood, listening. The bear's head swiveled toward Marcus, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. In those intelligent eyes, Marcus saw understanding, partnership, and something else, a shared recognition of the violence that was about to unfold. They had both been shaped by brutality, marked by it, and now they would face it together. Marcus opened the door slowly, scanning the white expanse beyond. The morning air bit at his lungs, sharp and clean, carrying the silence that comes after heavy snow. But beneath that silence, he detected something else, the distant whine of snowmobiles, still far off but closing. Kodiak moved past him into the snow, massive paws distributing his weight with surprising efficiency. The bear paused, sniffing the air, then looked back at Marcus with what could only be described as anticipation. This was no longer the wounded, desperate animal that had crashed through his door weeks ago. This was an apex predator, healed and ready for war. Marcus pulled the door closed behind him and followed Kodiak into the wilderness. They moved with purpose now, leaving the safety of the cabin for the uncertain dangers of the mountains. But Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't alone. The isolation that had defined his exile was broken, replaced by a partnership forged in shared survival. The sound of engines grew louder, echoing off the valley walls. Marcus counted at least 3 machines, maybe 4. Professional hunters with professional equipment, tracking their quarry with methodical precision. But they were hunting 2 creatures now, not 1, and they had no idea what they were walking into. As they climbed higher into the peaks, Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical thinking settling over his mind. Sightlines, cover positions, escape routes, the landscape transformed from wilderness into a battlefield. Beside him, Kodiak moved with equal purpose, his own predatory instincts awakened. The radio chatter grew more excited, more urgent. They had found the cabin, discovered it empty. Soon they would find the tracks leading up into the high country. The hunt was beginning in earnest, but this time the hunters would discover they had become the hunted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the weak morning sun. Ezra knelt beside the massive grizzly, his hand resting on the bear's flank as its breathing grew shallow and labored. The improvised splint on its hind leg had held through the night, but he could see the infection spreading despite his efforts with the precious antibiotics from his emergency kit. "Easy, old friend," he whispered, though he wasn't sure when he'd started thinking of the bear that way. 3 days had passed since it had crashed through his door, and in that time, everything had changed. The creature that had once terrified him now looked up with eyes that held an almost human intelligence, a trust that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. The bear's massive paw shifted, and Ezra noticed something glinting beneath the matted fur. Gently, he parted the coarse hair and found what he'd been dreading, a metal tag partially obscured by dried blood and debris. His fingers trembled as he cleaned it off, revealing a series of numbers and letters that made his blood run cold. Research Station Alpha 7. He knew that designation. It was carved into his memory like a scar that never healed. The bear, she was a she, he realized now, had been part of Dr. Helena Morrison's behavioral study. The same study he'd walked away from 5 years ago when he could no longer stomach what they were doing in the name of science. The same study that had cost him his career, his reputation, and eventually led him to this isolated mountain where he'd tried to bury his past. She stirred, those dark eyes finding his face, and he saw recognition there. Not just the trust of an injured animal for its caretaker, but something deeper. She remembered him too. "Christ, it's you," he breathed. Number 47, the one they called aggressive, the one they wanted to. He couldn't finish the thought. The memory of that last day at the facility crashed over him like an avalanche. The heated arguments. Helena's cold insistence that the problematic bears needed to be eliminated for the integrity of the data. His own furious refusal to participate in what he'd called scientific murder. The bear, 47, made a low sound, almost conversational, and struggled to lift her massive head. Ezra supported her, feeling the weight of 5 years of self-imposed exile pressing down on him like the snow outside. "I should have done more," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "I should have taken you all with me when I left. Should have exposed the whole damn program instead of just running away like a coward." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth was more complicated. He'd tried to blow the whistle, had contacted wildlife authorities, environmental groups, even journalists. Helena's connections ran deep, and his accusations had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and professional discrediting. By the time he'd realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered, his credibility was destroyed, and the bears were lost to him. All except this one, apparently. Somehow, 47 had survived whatever came after his departure, had escaped or been released, and had found her way to his mountain, to him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come here to escape human contact, to live as simply as possible, to forget the complexities of civilization and science and moral compromise. But the wilderness had sent him exactly what he'd been trying to forget, wrapped in 800 pounds of muscle and fur and desperate need. 47 feet's breathing hitched, and Ezra felt panic flare in his chest. The infection was winning despite everything he'd done. His supplies were nearly exhausted, and the nearest veterinarian was 100 miles of treacherous mountain road away. Even if the storm had completely cleared, even if his truck would start, even if he could somehow transport an injured grizzly without getting them both killed, it would take too long. But there was another option, one that made his stomach churn but might be her only chance. Helena's research station was only 30 miles north, accessible by snowmobile if the old trails were still maintained. He'd sworn he'd never set foot in that place again, had built his entire new life around avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. But looking down at 47 feet's trusting eyes, he realized that some promises were meant to be broken. "Okay, girl," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're going to take a little trip. Just you and me and some very old ghosts." The bear seemed to understand, her tail moving in what might have been an attempt at a wag. Ezra stood and began gathering supplies, his mind already racing through logistics and possibilities in the 100 ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't running away from his past. He was running toward it, and that made all the difference. The morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing where Kyle and Magnus had made their unlikely peace. The grizzly's massive form lay still beside the dying embers of their shared fire, his breathing deep and steady. The wound on his flank had stopped bleeding, and though infection remained a threat, the bear's natural resilience was already working its ancient magic. Kyle stirred first, his body protesting the night spent on frozen ground. Every muscle ached from the previous day's ordeal, but he was alive. They were both alive. He studied the great bear's face in the golden light, noting how the morning had softened the fierce lines around his eyes. In sleep, Magnus looked almost peaceful, a far cry from the enraged creature that had burst through his cabin door 3 days ago. The cabin. Kyle turned to survey the wreckage of his former life. Splintered wood and torn metal lay scattered across the snow, mixed with the remnants of his carefully hoarded supplies. 5 years of solitude, 5 years of running from who he used to be, reduced to debris. Yet strangely, he felt no grief for its loss. The cabin had been a prison as much as a refuge, and now it was gone. Magnus stirred, one amber eye opening to fix on Kyle with that unsettling intelligence. The bear's head lifted slowly, testing the air, testing the space between them. The rage was gone, replaced by something harder to define, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Easy, friend," Kyle murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "We're okay." The bear's eye closed again, but his breathing remained alert. Still wary, still ready to fight or flee, but no longer seeing Kyle as an immediate threat. It was progress. Kyle's stomach growled, reminding him of more practical concerns. Their shared supplies were nearly exhausted, and neither of them was in condition for hunting. He needed to get them both to safety, but where? The nearest town was 20 miles through treacherous mountain terrain, impossible for an injured grizzly to navigate. And even if Magnus could make the journey, what then? A wild bear in a human settlement would mean only one outcome. As if sensing his thoughts, Magnus opened both eyes and slowly pushed himself upright. The movement was careful, controlled, but Kyle could see the pain that flashed across the bear's features. The grizzly's massive head turned toward the tree line, toward the deep wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond. "You want to go home?" Kyle said softly. It wasn't a question. Magnus looked back at him, and in that gaze, Kyle saw something that made his breath catch. Recognition, not just of him as an individual, but of something deeper. The acknowledgement of a debt, perhaps, or the acceptance of an unexpected kinship forged in shared survival. The bear rose slowly to his full height, towering above Kyle even on 4 legs. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the space that had once meant life or death. Then Magnus took a step toward the wilderness, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. Kyle understood. The bear was offering him a choice. For 5 years, he had hidden from the world and from himself. He had built walls of solitude and silence, trying to bury the man he used to be beneath layers of isolation. But that man had saved them both, had found a way to reach across the vast gulf between species and touch something primal and true. Standing there in the morning light, surrounded by the wreckage of his old life, Kyle felt something shift inside his chest. The crushing weight he had carried for so long seemed to lighten, not disappearing entirely but becoming bearable. He thought of Sarah, his sister, whose letters he had left unanswered for 3 years. He thought of the friends he had abandoned, the life he had fled from in his grief and guilt. Maybe it was time to stop running. Magnus took another step toward the forest, then stopped again, waiting. "Go," Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You're free." The great bear studied him for a long moment, then did something that would stay with Kyle for the rest of his life. Magnus approached slowly, deliberately, and pressed his massive head against Kyle's chest, gently, carefully, with a tenderness that seemed impossible from such a powerful creature. The contact lasted only seconds, but in it, Kyle felt a forgiveness he had never thought to find in the wilderness. Not just Magnus's acceptance of him, but his own acceptance of himself. When the bear pulled away, his amber eyes held something that might have been gratitude. Then he turned and walked steadily into the tree line, his dark form disappearing into the shadows of the pine forest. Kyle watched until he could no longer see even a trace of movement, then shouldered his pack and began walking toward the distant valley where smoke from a ranger station curled up into the clear mountain air. Behind him, the wind scattered the last of their fire's ashes across the pristine snow.